Anyway, we're going to be talking about John tonight, and he's what I call the last of the big four, and who I'm terming the big four, obviously, is Andrew, Peter, James, and John, the two sets of brothers. And then Kevin Little was telling me Monday when the seniors went out to Pizza Inn that on, it's Tubi, I guess you call it Tubi, that documentary that included some of John MacArthur's work about 12 contemporary men were on there, so I watched it too. So if you get that in your stream, it was interesting. And he said in that documentary, I watched it, I think Monday night, that perhaps there's another set of brothers as well, other than Andrew and Peter and James and John. So if you stream, it might be worth your while to look at that. I found it very interesting, and so I just said that as something you may want to do. In MacArthur's book, if you're reading along as we're doing this study, then you'll know that it's titled John the Apostle of Love. And in John's own words, which are found in John 13, it says, "Now there was leaning on Jesus' bosom one of his disciples whom Jesus loved." Now John didn't mention his name. He never did mention his name in the book of John. But obviously that's who he's referring to. And John probably is one of the best known apostles, and part of the reason is because that he also was inspired by God to write 5 of the books of the New Testament. He wrote the book of John, the book of Revelation, and then he wrote 3 epistles. So John was credited with writing 4 of the different books in the New Testament, and only 2 people, to be quite honest with you, 2 humans write more words in the New Testament than John, and that's Luke and Paul. And of course, we know Paul gets credit for authorship of at least 13 of the New Testament books, and a lot of theologians believe that he obviously wrote Hebrews as well, but that's just speculation and opinion. Most of what we know about John comes from his own writings, as noted in that passage that we just read from John 13. And when you read and study and meditate the book of Revelation, you can certainly see how God's story ends. And without a doubt, if you're a Christian today, a believer in Christ, a follower of Jesus, then the story ends well. I find Revelation very interesting. I've done at least 3 studies at this church and the other church on the book of Revelation, and I believe you could do it every single day. It's just so much imagery and so much in Revelation. Of course, John was an older man when he was inspired by God to write the book of Revelation. As we already mentioned, and all of you already knew before we even started this study, I'm sure John was one of the inner circle. James, Peter, and John got to do a lot of things with Christ that the other apostles did not get to do. And after the Lord's resurrection, when you read the book of Acts, especially the first part of the book of Acts, you'll find that John was normally found with one other apostle. Who was it that John was normally with? Anybody know? Anybody? Peter. But Peter was always in the forefront. John's with him, but Peter's typically the one that's being aggressive, the one that's doing the talking, the one that's engaging in conversation with people. But John's there, especially in the first part of the book of Acts. And the author notes that almost everything that we studied about last week and talked about James's personality and character is also true of his brother John, henceforth the title Sons of Thunder. The same temper as James. John also was ready. If you remember, we talked about it last week when they asked Jesus about it. John, as well as James, was ready to call down fire from heaven to kill all the Samaritan people in the village that wasn't very hospitable to Jesus and his followers that were traveling through Samaria on the way to Jerusalem. So the same temper that James had, John had also. And John also was one of the key players in the debates among the apostles as far as who was the greatest. MacArthur points out because of all of John's personality traits and the way that he was, that only the work of Jesus Christ could have made John truly be known as the apostle of love. And if you'll read his writings, love is always one of the key themes. Truth and love are always two of the key themes of any of the writings of the apostle John. When you read the other three Gospels, Matthew, Luke, and Mark, you'll find that John is almost always named along with someone else. He's always in the company of other apostles. But only once in the three Gospels does John speak to Jesus alone. It's only recorded one time, and that's in the book of Mark, chapter 9, verse 38, when John goes to Jesus and he says, "Teacher, we saw someone casting out demons in your name." And nobody's telling Jesus this but John. So he said, "Master or teacher, we saw someone casting out demons in your name, and we tried to stop him because he was not following us." And if you read that verse of Scripture, and we'll get back to that in a little bit, then you'll realize that after John said those words to Christ, before long he got a rebuke for saying that. And Jesus straightens him out again, just like he does. And you can see, I don't think I've ever noticed as much in my lifetime in the study of the Word and reading the Bible, how much really and truly Jesus really taught those men in those 3 years. He was constantly in the teacher mode. Everything that he did almost was either an object lesson or a parable. He was constantly teaching, and of course we can see that those 12 men turned the world upside down. So obviously his teaching certainly paid off dividends. The end certainly justified the means, if you will. Unlike the others, John aged well. His areas of weakness, those areas that James had as well, turned into strengths. Strengths that only Jesus Christ can accomplish and change a person. You know, there's a lot of programs, a lot of great programs, like Celebrate Recovery, for example, wonderful program. But only God truly changes people. Programs help, but only God can truly do a work in an individual's life, and only God can change people. So John's zeal for the truth was shaped, as you can read in his writings, and I told somebody, it might have been Mary or it could have been Teresa Cash, but John's writings at times are just very hard for me to read. It's not as easy for me to read as Luke. Luke originally was writing to Gentile readers, whereas John was originally writing to Jewish readers, and I don't know if that's really got anything to do with it or not, but John sometimes talks, and you're going to hear me get into this, John talks in absolutes, and John writes in absolutes. And with John, there's not a gray area. And life, at least in my life, there's been a lot of gray areas. So, to quote MacArthur, he says, John writes and thinks in absolutes. He deals with certainties. Everything with the Apostle John is cut and dry. John is always black and white in his thinking. There's never a gray area. There aren't any gray areas in his teaching because, according to MacArthur, he tends to state things in the unqualified, analytical language. And John says, for example, and he's talking to all people, and this is found in 1 John. In fact, feel free to turn over there if you would like to 1 John. And we're in 1 John chapter 3, verse 9. And John says, we either are walking in the light or in the dark. Now that's an absolute statement. There's no gray area. There's no fence riding. You're either a Christian and you're obeying God and following God's commandments, or you're walking in the darkness and you're not of God. And that's exactly what John's saying. There's no other way to say that, whether we like that or whether we don't. That's what John's saying. Look with me in 1 John chapter 3, verse 9 in the ESV, English Standard Version. He says, no one born of God makes a practice of sinning, for God's seed abides in him, and he cannot keep on sinning because he's been born of God. John goes on to say in chapter 4, we're either of God or we're of the world. We can't ride the fence. You can't have it both ways. You're either a Christian and you're of God, or you're in darkness and you're in the world. You can't have it both ways according to the Apostle John. Look in verses 4 and 5 that are found in chapter 4. John says, little children, you are from God and have overcome them, for he who is in you is greater than he who is in the world. They are from the world, therefore they speak from the world, and the world listens to them. John went on to say, if we love, we're born of God, and if we don't love, we're not born of God. Look with me in verses 7 and 8. Beloved, let us love one another, for love is from God, and whoever loves has been born of God and knows God. Anyone who does not love does not know God, because God is love. In this the love of God was made manifest among us, that God sent his only Son into the world so that we might live through him. And then he goes on to even be more specific, and he says, whoever sins has neither seen God or known God. Look with me in chapter 3, verse 6. We find these words, no one who abides in him keeps on sinning. No one who keeps on sinning has either seen him or known him. John says all of these things without qualification and without softening of the hard lines. Because if you listen to the words that I just shared with you out of 1 John, there's not a gray area. It's either black or it's either white. You're either of God and you love everybody like God wants you to love everybody, because that is what? That's one of the great commandments, to love one another. So you're either of God and you really and truly do love one another, or if you don't like somebody and you got hard feeling against somebody and you hate somebody, then obviously according to John you're not of God, and you can't have it both ways. That's some pretty hard stuff to think about. And then even saying that about sinning, because there's not a single one of us that doesn't sin. Not a single one of us. The only one that ever came on this earth that hasn't sinned is Jesus. And that's why, I guess, Teresa Cash, that's why sometimes his writing becomes so difficult for me to really grasp, because we just said all these absolutes and all this no gray area, and it's either black or it's either white. But then you go over to his second epistle, and he calls for complete, total separation from all that's false. So he does it again, but then he ends his third epistle with some words that kind of says, well, I said all that, but now let me talk to you about, because we all are going to sin. So you got to really look at what he says, because he kind of comes back full circle in the third epistle. Before we go to the third epistle, though, let's go to the second epistle. He calls for complete, total separation from all that is false. So if you go to 2 John, obviously he's writing this elect lady and her children, whom I love in the truth, he says. That's in verse 1. And not only I, but also all who know the truth. But I want to call your particular attention to verses 9 through 11. Everyone who goes ahead and does not abide in the teaching of Christ does not have God. Now think about that for just a minute. John's saying, and I don't see how we can make it any other way, if you don't abide in the teaching of Christ, then you don't have God. And the teaching of Christ is to obey his commandments, and by this they'll know that you're my disciples if you love one another. And we're not all real good at that. But let's keep reading. He goes on and he says, Whoever abides in the teaching has both the Father and the Son. If anyone comes to you and does not bring this teaching, do not receive him into your house or give him any greeting, for whoever greets him takes part in his wicked works. So at that point, he is telling the people that he's writing to beware of the heresy in the church, to beware of people who come in and start teaching false doctrine. And there was a lot of things that were in conflict and caused a lot of contrast and a lot of controversy, just like we saw Peter and Paul getting into it, and Paul corrected Peter, and Peter found out Paul was right. And so a lot of things were going on in this early church. And John is basically warning the church, don't let these false people come in. I've personally, and I'm sure you have too, have seen preachers come into a church and absolutely destroy it. And destroy a church and cause it to divide in half, if not worse. Now I'm going to tell you something. I believe with all my heart, without a shadow of a doubt, and I'm getting sidetracked and running rabbit here, but I believe with all my heart that that pastor that did that is going to pay for it, because God's word tells me that a pastor is going to be held at a higher standard, and God did not call a pastor to cause disruption and conflict in the house of God. And I'll say that to any pastor, and I'll stand by it 120%. So when somebody's causing confusion, they're wrong and they're going to pay for it. And that's what John's saying. Don't come into the house, so be careful who you let come and teach. Make sure that they're solid, their doctrine is good, and their theology is good. And in our case as Baptists, you would want to make sure that they hear and believe in the Baptist faith and message of 2000, because that's the doctrine that this church says it believes in. So John is just that black and white. Of course, even as John's writing these things, he knows and he understands that he sinned, all of his apostles sinned, and he knows that every person he's ever met has sinned. So let's go to 1 John chapter 2 for a minute and read verses 8 and 10. And I think I meant to say, yeah, I did. Let me go, I apologize, I gave you the wrong 1 John. 1 John 3, it's just one chapter. Verse 2, Beloved, I pray that all may go well with you, and that you may be in good health as it goes well with your soul. And then look with me in 8, Therefore we ought to support people like these, that we may be fellow workers of the truth. And he goes on in verse 10, and he says, So if I come, I will bring up what he is doing, talking wicked nonsense against us, and not content with that. Talking about, and he said he refuses to welcome brothers, and also stops those who want to, and puts them out of the church. And says, do not imitate evil, but imitate good. He goes on to say, whoever does good is from God, and whoever does evil has not seen God. And then go back to the second epistle of John, and let's read verses 8. And he says, Watch yourself so that you may not lose what we have worked for, but win a full reward. Verse 10, If anyone comes to you and does not bring this teaching, don't receive him. So you got to realize that John said all that about that, but then he turns around and he goes back to 1 John in chapter 2, and he says these words. In verse 2 he says, My little children, I'm writing these things to you so that you may not sin. So that's what I mean that he contradicts himself. He says, I'm writing these things to you so that you may not sin, but if anyone does sin, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ the righteous. You go down to verse 8. He says, At the same time, it is a new commandment that I'm writing to you, which is true in him and in you, because the darkness is passing away and the true light is already shining. Verse 10, Whoever loves his brother abides in the light, and in him there is no cause for stumbling. So you see by what he said in that first verse in chapter 2 that obviously he is aware and does admit and realize that we as humans do sin. So we need to understand that. And John basically is concerned with the overall pattern of a person's life because he knows that we're all going to fall short. But as Paul said, God forbid that we use that as an excuse to keep on sinning. If there's some kind of sin in your life that you do continuously, day after day after day, then you really need to get into serious prayer time with God and ask Him to cure you from that. Paul, for example, took the time to explain all the struggles that we as believers have. And if you want to know about how Paul explained that, then make you a note and go home and read Romans chapter 7 tonight. Paul as well realized that we struggle with sin. All humans do. But John gave rules of thumbs, as we read about, without listing any exception. But I believe with all my heart that 3 years with Jesus changed John and James from the sons of thunder, and it certainly changed John to the apostle of love. John's overall quest in life, he seemed like he was always, from the beginning to the end, everything we can find about him, he was in a constant search for the truth. He used the word truth 25 times in the book of John, 20 more times in his epistles. And in his younger days, his zeal for truth was lacking in love and compassion for people. And he didn't have a lot of love and compassion for people. Remember, he was with James, as I talked about earlier, when he wanted to call down fire. And Jesus taught him to balance his thoughts with his emotions. Just like when John went to Jesus, and we started out in Mark chapter 9, when John went to Jesus and told him about the man casting out demons, and he said, I told him to quit, Master, because he's not following us. And you know, Jesus corrected him, and all this happened after the Mount of Transfiguration. And we know that on the Mount of Transfiguration that John, James, and Peter got to see the glory of God come down. Turn back with me to Mark chapter 9 for just a moment, if you will. In Mark chapter 9, I want to bring your attention to verses 33 and 34 again. And this was after the transfiguration, which occurred in chapter 9 as well. So they're coming back. They're heading towards Capernaum. And they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, what were you discussing on the way? But for once, it's as quiet as it is right here in this house, because they kept silent. Obviously, they kept silent because they were convicted, and they knew that Jesus knew that all the way on that road, they were arguing and fussing about who was the greatest. But verse 34 says, but they kept silent, for on the way they had argued with one another about who was the greatest. Notice they all got real quiet because they knew they was wrong. And as I said again about Jesus Christ, this is a great big teaching moment for him in front of all of them. Jesus called in all 12, and this is what he said beginning in verse 35. And he sat down, and he called the 12, and he said to them, if anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all. And he took a child and put him in the midst of them, and taking him in his arms, he said to them, whoever receives one such child in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me. It was a serious rebuke to all of them, and I suspect especially to James and John and Peter. But I believe John got the message loud and clear, and I believe he was convicted at that moment, and I believe that's why he said what he said to Jesus in verse 38. Teacher, we saw someone casting out demons in your name, and we tried to stop him because he wasn't following us. MacArthur's opinion was that John confessed this to Jesus because he was under conviction, and I agree with him. John was beginning to change immediately, and Jesus was working in his life. I told somebody Sunday, I picture my life as one of these great big old rocks and boulders. And I believe all my life God's had a chisel and a hammer, and he's just chipped away at the parts of me that don't need to be here, and he's still chipping today. But when he gets finished, then I get promoted and I get to go to glory land. And I believe we can see John really maturing as you read this and think about how his zeal, his passion started changing, and he started having compassion for people. And I think he realizes he probably shouldn't have said that to that fella. And he starts having more compassion for people. And so John learned the lesson well. The second epistle that we read offers vivid proof of how well he balanced the twin virtues of truth and love. And he reminded his readers that we're to love one another. So the first half of the epistle is all about love, and he urges that woman and her children not only continue walking in the truth, but to remember that the sum and balance of God's law is love. And we go back to 2 John. I don't know for sure that we read all of the 6 verses that I would like to in chapter 2, and it's not going to hurt us to read them again. So let's go back to 2 John, verses 6 through 11. And this is love, that we walk according to his commandments. This is the commandment just as you have heard from the beginning, so that you should walk in it. For many deceivers have gone out into the world, those who do not confess the coming of Christ in the flesh. And so again, he's talking about love. And in verse 5 he says, and now I ask you, dear lady, not as though I were writing you a new commandment, but the one we've had from the beginning, that we love one another. And the Word tells us if we love like we're supposed to love, it'll cover a multitude of sins. There's no greater commandment than the one that says you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. And the second like it is to itself, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. However, you continue to read that epistle, you'll find that John balances things out by urging this woman not to compromise love by receiving false leaders. Remember the incident when John and James asked for special seats and special treatment? Over and over, Jesus constantly emphasized the importance of humility and servanthood. And John finally learned that. I believe he really did. Because if you read the 4 Gospels and the 2 writings of Peter, in 1 Peter and 2 Peter, I think you'll see that John's the only gospel writer to record the washing of the apostles' feet on the night of betrayal. Now, I've told you I've personally participated in foot washing. It's one of the most humbling experiences that I have ever partaken in my entire life. And John's humility, I think, comes through in a gentle way in his writing. John remained courageous and bold and passionate, but he found balance. And he was living an example of humility. He was the only disciple to live to an old age, but I'm going to tell you something. In so many ways, he suffered as well. Maybe, and I'd never thought about this before until I started reading this writing of John MacArthur, but maybe in ways that we don't even realize. For example, John was still on this earth, enduring anguish and persecution long after the others were all gone to glory. I've always said, I'll always say, I've got a grandchild here listening to me, but I mean it with all my heart. For a person who has his faith and his trust in Jesus Christ, there's a lot of things on this earth so much worse than physical death. Because like Billy Graham said, I'm going to be more alive at that moment than I've ever been. And I understand John suffered because he was left totally alone. All of his other friends were gone. All of his other apostles were gone. On the night of Jesus' arrest, John probably began to understand the true bitterness of the cup that Jesus looked at them and said, yeah, you don't know what you ask. You don't know what baptism I'm going to, and you don't know what you're asking. But I believe that night when he went to the high priest's home, talked to the servant girl and got Peter permission to come in, and saw what they were doing to Jesus Christ, I believe he'd started understanding totally what baptism that Jesus Christ was talking about. We know he followed Jesus, as I said, and we know that he watched him being bound and beaten. And to my knowledge, he's the only apostle or disciple to watch the entire crucifixion. He saw the nails. Obviously, he was there when the soldier pierced Jesus' side with a spear. And I think he remembered probably at that point that he had told Jesus, yes, I'm willing to partake in that same baptism. While James is his brother, his older brother, and he loved him a lot, was beheaded, John bore the loss of losing an earthly brother in a personal way that I'm sure the other apostles didn't. Then he watched all of his brothers in Christ martyred one by one. And soon he was totally alone. Jesus was gone. Thaddeus, little James, Andrew, Peter, Bartholomew, they were all gone and he was totally alone. And I think he may have in some ways suffered more painfully than the others together. More reliable sources in the early, most reliable sources in the early church history tell us that John became the pastor of the church in Ephesus that Paul had planted. We know that John was eventually banished to an island called Patmos, and that's where he lived in a cave and was inspired by God to write the readings that we read in the book of Revelation. John had learned to bear suffering willingly, and he learned well. John even, according to the historians, gave care to Mary, the mother of Jesus. And history records record that John never left Jerusalem or Mary until her death. He did exactly what Jesus asked him to do at the cross that day when he said, John, behold your mother. Jerome, who was a writer and a historian, was an early Christian priest, theologian, translator, and historian, says in his commentary on Galatians that the aged apostle John was so frail in his final days at the church of Ephesus that he had to be physically carried into the church. One phrase, however, that they said was constantly on John's lips was this, and I quote, "My little children, love one another." And then when asked why he always said this, he replied, "It's the Lord's command. And if this alone be done, it is enough." Andrew, Peter, James, and John, the fishermen of Galilee, became fishers of men in a big way. In a sense today, if you really think about it, they're still casting their nets into the world by their testimony that's recorded in the gospel and the epistles that God inspired them to write. Randy, would you close us in prayer, please?